Hello and welcome to Global News Today. I'm your host, Michael Prendergast. Coming up in today's show, we have a very special interview with Riz Khan, who speaks about his life and career and how media has changed over the past 40 years. But coming up first, President Joe Biden has announced he has stage 4 cancer. To speak on that, we've got Professor Karol Sikora, world-famous oncologist, to break it down. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Professor Karol Sikora. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. What I would like to ask is, how serious is this for President Biden, particularly at this stage? It has been announced that it's stage 4.
This is serious. And there are two things in the data that's been released by the White House that carry a poor outcome. First of all, the stage, as you say correctly, it was stage 4, which means it spread right outside the prostate gland, and we've been told it's in multiple sites in his bones, which is the very common way in which prostate cancer spreads. The second feature is what's called the Gleason score. That's a pathology grading from the biopsy that suggests the cells have lost the normal architecture of the prostate gland and are resembling fast-growing cancer cells. So the stage and the grade give you a likely outcome. Also his age, he's 82, and as you get older, these aggressive cancers tend to be more difficult to treat. And
there's one question in my mind. Obviously, the healthcare afforded to a former president is, I would say, it's some of the best in the world. How did he get to stage 4 without this being detected earlier?
I think you're right. The president will get the best care in the world. No expense will be spared. There'll be no delays in anything. You won't have to wait a few weeks to see a general practitioner or anything. They have in-house doctors in the White House and where he is now. So there's no doubt he will get the best care in the world. The first line of attack for the cancer will be hormonal treatment to suppress the male sex hormone, testosterone, that's normally produced. It reduces as you get older, but it will be there. And so hormones will be given to suppress its production, first of all at the pituitary level and then in the testes themselves. And that will hopefully cause a regression of the cancer. But eventually the disease will become resistant to hormonal change and it'll be chemotherapy. And that's where it's difficult to give good doses of chemotherapy drugs to elderly patients.
Of course, and that leads me on to my next question. How taxing is this to be at a man of his age? As you said, he's 82.
So the hormone therapy is not at all a problem. There's very little side effects from it. There are a few and they're individually specific, but most people, even in their 90s, tolerate hormone treatment. Once hormone treatment is no longer working, it becomes much more difficult. There are treatments out there, drugs and radiation treatments that can be delivered right around the body, but they become more and more arduous for older people. I mean, quite frankly, looking at him over the last 5 years, he's deteriorated in his physical stance. I mean, at the moment, everyone says, well, maybe they knew he had prostate cancer, or maybe that was contributing to what seemed like a cognitive decline. But, you know, I doubt that. The Americans are so upfront with information about cancer. I think if he had cancer when he was president and they knew about it, they'd have made that public. I think it's unlikely that that's the case, although there are stories appearing in the global media that maybe there was some sort of conspiracy of silence.
As you just stated, this could have a huge impact on his cognitive function. What is the risk going forward of someone of his age going through a harsh battery of chemotherapy? Does that have the capacity to cause a further decline?
It could do. There's no doubt that giving chemotherapy to people over 80 is challenging, much more challenging than, say, someone of your age or even someone in their 60s. And the reasons for that are complicated. The liver and kidney doesn't work so well, and the general brain tolerance of external influences, such as the drugs to be used for chemotherapy, is poorer as people age. We tend to adapt it by giving more gentler doses and gentler types of drug. But the trouble is, once the disease becomes resistant to the drugs, then it grows out of control. And you know, the overall outlook for a grade a high grade, which is what he has, and a high stage, stage 4 cancer, is relatively poor in someone of his age.
And someone with your wealth of experience as an oncologist, we've seen a growing level of cancers over the past 50 years. Is it processed food? Is it smoking or drinking? What is it in your mind that's driving this huge increase of cancers in the world?
The biggest driver of cancer is age. The older the population gets, and that means they're living longer, so it's good news. Medical technology, even in poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, allows people to live longer than they did a decade ago. And that means that the cancer incidence goes up. Some poor countries have a double dilemma. They have the diseases like cancer associated with age, but they still have the classical infectious diseases that kill: tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV. And it's really a balance. But in a country like the United States or in the UK, where I am, cancer and cardiac disease are becoming much more important because of their prevalence in the population as it ages.
Are there any preventative measures against, as I said, there's these huge waves, these huge increases in cancer? What can an average person do to minimize the risk of getting cancer?
The most important thing is look at your diet. Don't eat too much fat. Eat lots of vegetables and fruits. No need to go vegetarian, but just be careful with high fat content meat. So lamb, although delicious, have a small amount. Don't eat a lot. When it comes to exercise, it's really good for you. Exercise actually reduces the incidence of cancer as well as heart disease. And then look at lifestyle. So alcohol is bad in excess. And obviously, in countries where there's so much sun, such as where you are, not to get red with the sun, because that can result in skin cancer. It's all about a balance, a healthy lifestyle, a healthy diet, and plenty of exercise. And it doesn't matter what the exercise is: swimming, snorkeling, gyms, doesn't matter. Just do lots of exercise and avoid getting overweight. There's a lot we don't understand about cancer. For example, young people are getting an increased incidence of a variety of common cancers. We don't know why. People under 40 are getting it. And we think it's due to dietary change causing the microorganisms in the gut, the so-called microbiome, to change. And that probably is one of the reasons for it. So there's a lot to be found out. But at the moment, the best advice I can say is exercise and diet, healthy diet, and lots of exercise all the time.
Fascinating insights. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Karol Sikora.
Pleasure.
Joining me now is Riz Khan. Riz, thank you so much for your time. I'd like to start off this interview with your upbringing.
Michal, thanks for the invite. It's always fun to have the tables turned. It's always a reminder to me how my interviewees feel at the end of each interview. So my upbringing was an interesting one because of where it started and where it sort of ended up. As a journalist, I get to meet people with fantastic backstories, so mine seems quite insignificant to me now. But I was born in Aden, in Yemen, when it was a British colony. So my passport has Aden written in it. It doesn't actually have any country, it just says Aden. It was a British colony run out of India, ironically at the time, with the Indian rupee as the currency. So there was a civil war basically when I was about 4 years old. The country split into north and south. And so being in South Yemen in Aden, we left as it turned into a communist government, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. And having been born with British passports, my family was basically able to flee to London. My mother used to get upset when I said we fled to London. Anytime I said it anywhere public, she said, we didn't flee, we had the passports. So I have to now say we strategically withdrew with the British. So, but my roots actually are essentially Indian and Pakistani mix. Although the irony is my mother, myself, my brother, my father, we were all born under British rule. So my mother born in British Yemen as well, in Mukalla. My father born in Amritsar in British India and becoming Pakistani in the partition. And so it's kind of ironic that we have that mix of South Asian culture, which was still kind of prevalent at home, the Arabic culture, and my mother and family was completely fluent in Arabic. I lost it when we moved to London. And then growing up in a very British environment, which, you know, I'm easily identified by my accent. So it's an interesting mix. And then having lived in the Middle East, the UK, the US, it's quite a good, kind of an interesting upbringing to have as a journalist.
Yes, and I'm sure in that, having that interesting upbringing, as you said, at the British Empire, the sun had never set on the British Empire. Is that what sparked your interest in journalism or in current affairs and world affairs?
Well, I just discovered the hours we work in journalism means the sun never sets on us either. So maybe it was a natural, you know, I was trying to cling on to the empire in some way. But actually, no, I didn't have any interest in journalism from an early age. Since I was 6, I wanted to be a doctor. So my background was always science and medical. I was actually, you know, really keen from an early age to be a doctor, surgeon in particular. And the way I ended up in journalism is that basically I did my degree in medical physiology. I didn't get a grant for the time I needed to do an MBCHB, but I was given a place to complete my studies to become a doctor, full-on doctor, if I did 3 years clinical studies. And by then I was in a single-parent family. My mother and father divorced when I was 6. So we never had the funds to kind of pay my way through, you know, the clinical courses that I needed to for 3 years. So journalism was kind of a way to do something while I raised the money to go back into medicine. But I, you know, started out in BBC local radio, and it's so badly paid you feel like you're paying them to be there. So I never really had a chance. And then my career kind of took off quite quickly. That's what changed things.
And where was that in local radio?
So I started out, I mean, I studied radio journalism in a small college, 1-year course in Cosham, just outside Portsmouth in the south of England. And I was sent to Radio Lancashire in the north as part of my kind of internship, as you'd call it now, attachment, as we called it at the BBC. And that's when I first went north of Watford as a southerner in England. And Radio Lancashire became quite a big thing for me because apart from my first experience in a radio station, and I woke up at 6 a.m. and heard my first report on local radio, and it was quite absolutely fascinating as an experience. It was the fact that I discovered another part of the country, how cultures vary across the UK itself. And I actually volunteered at so many BBC radio stations while I desperately looked for work that I actually got to see a lot of the country too. So I was all over the place.
And everyone speaks about their big break. What was your big break in radio and then into TV?
So I guess in a way the break for me into radio was when I was at Radio Lancashire. I was basically unpaid. I was doing everything, you know, volunteering and helping out. And the deputy editor at Radio Lancashire happened to be sent to fill in for 6 months or a year or so up in Cumbria, at Radio Cumbria, even further north, to you know, to take over while the manager was on leave. So I ended up being asked by her. She saw how much I worked hard for free at Radio Lancashire, so I think she thought he'll be cheap. So I ended up in Cumbria, and that was my first contract, actually, and it was just amazing to know I would earn something for 6 months. But while I was there, I was applying for pretty much everything under the sun, especially at the BBC, and ended up on something called the News Trainee Scheme. And that was an interesting one because they never took my kind of person, if you like. By that I mean I wasn't from privately educated schooling. I wasn't from Oxford or Cambridge, and almost everyone in the News Trainee Scheme was from that background. They had 9,000 applications and 12 places, so I don't know how I got on. But that was really the big break because that's where I was trained for both radio and TV, and that was almost like a fast track within the BBC. You know, the trainees were almost anyone you know on TV now, like Jeremy Paxman, Richard Quest was there around the same time as me. A whole bunch of people you would know came from that scheme. So, as you said, being of a British Asian origin, did you experience any discrimination? Obviously, being the first British Asian to be a news anchor as well, you broke the mold in a way. Well, it was funny, you know. Again, when I think back to how I, you know, got onto the News Trainee Scheme, it was about a year later they actually started to look into. They did like a little commission to look into diversity at the BBC and started something called the Asian Afro-Caribbean Scheme. And I remember one day, you know, this is before the Afro and Asia Caribbean Scheme, someone saying to me, "Oh, are you the token ethnic?" You know, and I said, "Well, I never thought of that myself that way, but I was the first person, you know, brown guy as they called it around there." I think it's because I sounded British, and the BBC and Britain in general, maybe a little less so now, but Britain in general is rather, it's still very classist, I guess, but it was very classist at the BBC, and someone had to sound like they were from the BBC, probably more than look like it. I mean, I guess they might have thought I'd be stuck on radio and never go in front of a camera. But
did you practice it at home, or
so
elocution?
No, nothing like that. Actually, that's an interesting thing. They never taught us at the BBC how to present. We were always taught how to write, how to produce, how to do journalism. We were taught law, legal stuff for journalists and stuff, and public administration, that kind of stuff. But actually, the one thing I had to do was slow down, because I still speak very quickly. But it was much worse, to the point where there were times I played drums with a band. On the weekend, we recorded on a cassette. Do you remember those little things we took? So
just about.
Yeah, just about in your case, I guess. And I heard the recording played back, and there was someone I couldn't understand. I said, "Who is that?" And they said, "That's you." I said, "I can't understand what I'm saying." I was speaking so quickly, So I did slow down.
So what was the reaction in the newsroom?
I guess because, again, I worked hard. I did long shifts, so, I would always fill in. I've always been committed to working. So even though my passion was medicine, I soon developed a large interest in what journalism was about. Always worked hard. I think work ethic is a crucial thing, whatever the job, really, whatever the job. And I think because I was always around, willing to do stuff, always, kept it friendly with everyone, always asked questions. I hope for the right questions, just to learn, and never took anything for granted. And I think that was an important factor. So I felt I blended in quite easily and fit in quite quickly.
Did you feel pressure from your community as a representative of them I suppose, to do your best for your community?
The people of Hounslow?
Yeah.
No, actually, no. So the interesting thing is, I didn't think of it that way, but I had so many people as I got established, young Asians would come up to me and say, thank you so much for sticking with it, because I was able to say to my folks, oh, look, there's one of us there, so it can be done. Because South Asian culture, even my mother thought I was going to go back to medicine for the longest time. And she'd always ask me, by now I was doing radio and a bit of TV, and she'd say, when are you going to go back into medicine? Because I guess, those kind of jobs feel safe, secure, and respected. But the only time she actually started to kind of question her pushing me back to medicine was when I appeared on TV, and her friends would start calling her and say, oh, we saw your son on TV. And then she was like, is that a real job? So I didn't feel pressure to represent anyone, but I do take the trouble to talk to people, to mentor them as much as I can, for the simple reason that I benefited a lot from having mentors in the industry. And so irrespective of background, whatever, I would say to people, learn from the people around you who have experience. And that's what I try to do, and that's what I try to give back.
So this moves on to the BBC World Service. What was it like being part of the launch team of that, a very exciting project at the time?
So the interesting thing was I was with the BBC in total for about 8 years. I had 1 year out where I joined the independent sector. My only real experience in the BBC and independent were the two main players. And I was in the independent sector for a year at Central TV in Birmingham, which is actually where I met one of my closest friends, Neil Curry, whom you know because he's my executive producer.
Of course.
So we were in
Lovely
journalism
man.
then. You have to say that because he's nearby. So what happened was that was a great year. I got to report, I got to present, anchor, I got to do so much, and it was a fantastic year, made such a good friend and good friends generally. But I got called asking if I wanted to be part of something called BBC World Service Television News, BBC WSTV, and I was like, there is no BBC WSTV. And the guy who hired me, was one of the bosses, said, no, you idiot, we want to launch it. So I only had 1 year at Central, and I was back at the BBC in 1990, end of 1990, no, beginning of 91. We launched BBC World Service TV in November 1991. And I co-presented with a woman anchor, I co-presented the very first show back then. And, it was an interesting time because the BBC had thought of World Service TV News forever. They now just call it BBC World. But they thought of it forever and never got around to doing it until CNN appeared on the scene. Then they panicked and launched BBC World Service TV News.
Yes, and that brings us on to CNN, which I believe is the golden age of cable news. Yeah. So you've gone from BBC International, then to the CNN International. What was that like? You moved to Atlanta. It was a huge shift in your life.
It was, and I actually wasn't keen to go. When I was approached initially by then Vice President, sadly he's passed away now, Peter Vesey. He called me and he said, we'd love you to come to America and come and join. And I said, look, I'll come and have a look. But I'm, in all honesty, I like my job very much at BBC World. It was just really, it was good. I enjoyed it, great crew, and we were pioneering, it felt like, Anyway, I went out to Atlanta in October 1992, had a look around, and it was a very sleepy town back then. And I just said to Peter, really, I'm not that interested, in all honesty. Then they came back one more time, another, offer, and, oh, come on, we'd really like you to join. I said no again. Then I was talking to my boss at the BBC all along. I explained to her, look, I keep getting approached by CNN. And it was her who said, on the third approach, you should accept this, because if they want you that badly, it's a good sign. And secondly, it's an adventure and you can always come back. With that mental safety net, I thought I'll go and give it a try. It was such a different culture and environment. And again, we were setting up CNN International. I was one of the first recruits, setting it up from scratch. So that made it exciting. And the pace was totally different from the BBC. BBC didn't have breaking news in those days. And so suddenly I was like, get on the set now. Well, my show isn't until, no, breaking news. So it was a big learning curve. Yeah, it was a fantastic time, actually.
Yeah, and what was your experience with Ted Turner? Obviously, him and the world of TV and news in general, as well as sport, a towering figure. Do you have any personal anecdotes of him?
I love Ted. He was I don't consider him, a visionary, which is what people tend to call him. I think he's a maverick, and by that I mean that he was the kind who would push the boundaries, irrespective, just because people said you couldn't do it. I mean, Elon Musk is a bit like that, with the whole electric cars, you've got to do it. People are saying, I don't think it can really be viable. And of course, he kind of proved it was, and it's just accelerated the race to get electric cars out there. And in that sense, Ted Turner spoke whatever, he shot from the hip, as they said in America. He did what he wanted to, said what he wanted to, and when someone said you can't do 24-hour news, he was determined to do it. So it's not like he planned it out and said, hey, isn't it time we had 24-hour news? And he was always funny because he would say things that would now be very politically incorrect, but also just his approach to things. He was cheeky, he would walk around the CNN center, very loud voice, deep Southern accent. One time there was a bridge across the center of the atrium at CNN Center, and there was a lot of tourists. I mean, he made it a tourist, venue. And these Korean or Japanese tourists were crossing, taking pictures of everything, and with a tour guide, paying tourists. And Ted, in the middle, stopped, and of course they turned around when the tour guide said, well, that's Ted Turner, the founder. They were like, and he's like, hey, Riz, can you believe these guys? They make me $1 million a year. So he was, he was a character.
Yes, and in the golden age of media, as it was, you had some incredible stories. The one that stands out for me that I know you covered was OJ Simpson.
Well, yeah, it almost covered itself, because for me it was a bit bizarre. It was one of the first big stories when we launched CNN International's newsroom. April '94 is when CNN International officially got its own facility and became this kind of big independent channel from CNN. Before that, we were kind of blending in with their stuff and using their facilities. And suddenly we were sitting there just watching hours on end of a court case with OJ Simpson and the car chase and everything else that happened before that. And to me, that was a bit strange because, it was so Americana for a start. That was a great story. It was unique. But it was a strange thing to be doing because I was thinking, well, why aren't we doing international news? There's things happening everywhere. But it was one of the first big stories, yeah. So, we were everyone's eyes were glued to that. Around the world as well because of CNN.
And it was a very charged time, obviously, racially. The court case, it spawned a lot of division at the time. Yeah. Did you feel that in the newsroom?
Well, yeah, Atlanta was a big shock for me coming from the UK, which was for me, very diverse, very multicultural. My friends were from every background and colour, especially in West London. It was a very diverse area. And coming to Atlanta, where Atlanta first is considered a black city, They had, one of the first black mayors, if not the first black mayor, but certainly one of the first. And it was a big hub for black music, for African-American culture and everything in general. But it always struck me as being a bit strange, having come from the UK, that at the end of the day, white people went one way, black people went the other. And there was a lot I learned about racial politics and how strong they still are in the US being in Atlanta. And yeah, when the OJ Simpson verdict was announced that he was not guilty, it was interesting to watch the reaction in the newsroom, that in the case of a lot of the white people, there was dismay. In the case of a lot of the black people, there was joy. So again, it kind of reflected what was happening in society to some degree. But, you know, it's a much deeper story and issue than simply just saying it was because black people were happy and white people were not. It's a much deeper story overall, America's race politics.
What did you make of the verdict personally? Guilty or not guilty?
Well, you know, look, and not through any particular race prejudice, definitely not, because, you know, of my diversity, but I just thought there was a lot of theatre. And I think the verdict might have been different had there not been so much theatre and race politics around it. Let's put it that way.
Okay, well, that's the power of the media in in court cases. I'm just going to move on to Al Jazeera English, which from CNN you were approached. How did that transpire?
Well, so, you know, I think people around the world, countries around the world, you know, governments around the world, realizing that having an international presence on television, and by then satellite had boomed, people had more access to media globally, realized that controlling the message or having some say in the message was probably a good thing. So a lot happened in one go. Channels like, well, Al Jazeera obviously wanted to create its English language channel, having had success in the Arab world and controversy, but success certainly in the Arab world with Al Jazeera Arabic. But, you know, RT, Russia Today started up, France 24 started up, Deutsche Welle developed its international arm as well, the German channel, and CGTN, CCTV9, originally the English language channel, which became CGTN. So global media was expanding like crazy anyway, and I think Al Jazeera wanted to have a presence. Interestingly, unlike the other two launches with which I was involved, we weren't part of a big network and using their facilities. With us, it was just, you're on your own, you start out. Though we had the resources and the funding, was very good. But we were not part of the Arabic channel in any way, which made it a product from scratch, completely from scratch. That was a very interesting time. Probably the most interesting kind of launch I've ever been involved with.
Yes, and having to build trust in a Middle Eastern news organization in a time, obviously, the Gulf War, etc. What was the biggest challenge in actually creating an aura of integrity in a new source of media?
What was interesting was I opted to be out of, because we built 4 hubs. The headquarters was Doha, which was the main hub. There was Kuala Lumpur in Asia. We had London, an obvious place of it, and then Washington, D.C., because, of course, that's such a big hub for global power. So I opted to be in DC because I'm not a manager, so I wasn't involved with the management. I avoided it as much as I was a director, the founding director. But I actually ended up doing my shows out of DC, so I would have more guests on set and have access to the US ambassadorial crowd, the US government and people, and it worked out very well that way. But what was interesting was, of course, we were bringing the Al Jazeera brand in English to Washington, D.C., when George Bush was in power, and Donald Rumsfeld, all the people around him hated the Arabic channel. So Al Jazeera was always being described as Osama bin Laden's network, the terrorist network, and so on. And here we were as the English version. But the beauty of it was, I mean, I was with Colin Powell, General Colin Powell, who was, you know, as you know, Secretary of State as well. He was with me at an event in Malaysia with Mahathir Mohamad, and he said to me, I haven't seen you on CNN for a while. I said, actually, I'm involved in launching the new English language Al Jazeera. He said, oh, you guys gave us so many problems. I said, well, it wasn't us because we're not there yet, you know. But then I saw him a year later, and he came up to me at a meeting where there was a big gathering I was moderating with Hillary Clinton and now the late Richard Holbrooke, and he actually walked up and said, it's excellent, it's the best thing I've seen. So, you know, it was good that we could vindicate ourselves. I think people are learning to have less fear when it comes to, even with Al Arabiya. You know, the name Al Arabiya is an Arab description of Arabia, if you like, the Arabian maybe. So it's good that the West is learning to become more comfortable with non-Western branding.
So speaking of the Clintons, you have interviewed them. Is there a great deal of fear, or how do you prep for interviewing a president?
You know, I've been lucky. Obviously, there are protocols, there's respect that's needed, and I've learned to treat people as people, from the lowliest to the highest, as human beings. But obviously, I have to reflect in my work and my approach with them and to them that I recognize their position, the protocols that are needed around there. So I'm very respectful. I have friends who are ambassadors who I have dinner with and call by first name, and we're buddies, if you like. But I would never refer to them in that way in public presence, because I have to respect their position and not kind of bring it to our relationship. So my approach is to treat people as people, and the same even with presidents, even the U.S. president. One thing that Bill Clinton and to some degree Hillary Clinton did was make it easy for the media. Bill Clinton had a gift of making a person feel like they were the only person in the room. When he stopped, hey, it's good to meet you, and you're there, locking eyes, and he maintains eye contact, and it's quite unique. I've not known many people who can do that. Hillary Clinton's a strong character. I interviewed her as First Lady and then as Secretary of State. She actually requested to come on my show on Al Jazeera, showing we had some validity and validation from the US government. But the preparation is always the same as for any interview. Learn as much as possible about the subject, learn as much as possible about not just the person, but the subject, meaning the topics. And because, you could interview the same person 5 times, but you may have 5 different angles on 5 different stories with that person. So it's preparation and getting to know what would be the right way to approach the questioning to make it as unique as possible, because everyone's getting a chance, in some cases, to interview these kind of people. It's preparation is a big thing.
And in terms of the media landscape, it's changed a lot over the past 4 decades. We're very much into the digital zeitgeist. How have you found your experience at Al Arabiya English? You've interviewed the likes of Andrew Tate, RFK Jr., these people who comprise most of the comments, especially on YouTube. They're very divisive characters. How have you found the transition from, I suppose, traditional legacy media into the digital zeitgeist?
Well, in all honesty, I don't think I've undergone any transition in every sense. I think what it is that I've stuck with my tenets of journalism, which is to do the job properly. Now, there's 2 sides to it. There's the content and there's the delivery platform. Now, the content has varied a lot because the delivery platforms have changed, whether it's in duration, short TikTok videos, for example, or Instagram, Facebook. All the methods of delivery, YouTube has provided the opposite, 3-hour interviews, and podcasts. So I think content is still content, and the delivery platform often determines how that content is delivered, but journalism should be journalism. Now, this gets into a whole deep mire of what is real journalism. We can talk about that in a second. But for me, it's been very hard to get used to using social media, only because I'm still stuck on the traditional ways of doing things. I mean, I was taught at the BBC to leave out adjectives in writing content, whereas obviously for colourful, leave out content in adjectives in news. Really, that's what it is, so that the story doesn't get a nuance or a bias. If you call one example I give, is where with Donald Trump, a lot of the time the media has just taken the liberty of saying, even traditional media channels have taken the liberty of saying things like he's making baseless allegations. Now, it's not, in my opinion, it's not for the journalist to say he's making baseless allegations if they're already saying he's offered no evidence, for his claims. So it's a balance, really. But the social media has been very interesting because it's incredible how powerful it has become in influencing people. And Andrew Tate's prime example. I was in Chicago, in a store in Chicago, where 2 young guys came up to me and said, "You're the guy who interviewed Andrew Tate." And I was thinking, they don't watch Al Arabiya for sure. They don't probably watch any news, but when they do a search, the interview with Andrew Tate comes up. So it's a really interesting situation to be in, where the power of social media, where it's not necessarily verified or qualified, is greater than the traditional media in so many ways. But then traditional media, that's another conversation, has slipped in its own direction and lost its legacy and its validity.
Agreed, and I think a lot of that validity actually has been lost by legacy media over, as you said, I suppose, the polarized nature. We don't have to name names, but we all know the networks that, as you said, they're quite brash in their their unbiased nature. So the one thing about yourself I can say, having worked with you now for 18 months, is that it really is a skill, and as well I think it's a lost art, having an objective view, and or to try not, as you said, to overly use adjectives when describing a story.
Training has disappeared to a large degree in the traditional media, and I think that's a key factor in getting people to understand what is the right way to approach a story and what isn't, and why it's important to have sources to authenticate the content. Just simply saying anything for sensation is not the way to do proper journalism. But you see, what's also interesting is that it is difficult to be up against these social media platforms that can put out so much. Where the traditional media went wrong is, as it got onto satellite and became 24-hour and had to fill time, it becomes very expensive to gather news. Generally, putting reporters into the field, crews, accommodation, travel, all this stuff is expensive. And news used to be a lost leader for many channels. It was mandated by charters and conventions that these channels had to have news, which is why they did it. But they made their money through programming, entertainment, and so on. They could afford to spend on news. Now, news channels, which may have to try to prove they're making money, or at least not go into deficit, the easiest option for them is to just simply put talking heads on. And that's where a lot of the main channels went wrong, is they started to just get opinion makers or opinion offerers, I guess, and commentators on to talk. And that way, the content seems to develop its own bias. That's where things, I think, have largely gone wrong, is that it's less about the news gathering and news reporting than it is about commentary and opinion. And that's where the biases come in, whether perceived or real.
Do you think the media has now prioritised clicks over truth?
Well, it depends which media you're talking about. I think clicks mean everything to someone who's making money from them. And I'm pretty sure that, in many cases, there's no real care given to whether or not it's authentic. This awful expression, take action and apologize later. Better to actually do it and then apologize than to ask permission, is really what's guiding a lot, I think, of people. They'd rather, not ask permission and just apologize later.
So across all of the networks and the eras that you've worked in, what are the guiding principles for a young journalist now, in your mind?
I think to be an authentic journalist, it takes the time and trouble, or the person should take the time and trouble to learn the craft, which means training. It actually means training how to write, because there's one side of it, there's the content, in terms of truth and whatever, but there's also how to present a story. So there's the writing aspect of it, there's the journalistic aspect of the writing, which is the fact-checking, the authentication of the content, and so on. And then there is the critical thinking when it comes to sources. For journalists to really understand what is real and what is not, they have to be able to think critically. And what's been missing for a long time is people being taught to think critically. I remember going on a course that was done by this brilliant guy. He made us all as journalists. It was just to illustrate something in the early days of the internet. He made us all go online on computers and read a story about Martin Luther King on a website. And it starts off, Martin Luther King, who was a pioneer, or not pioneer, but sort of leading figure in the civil rights movement, blah, blah, blah. And we're all thinking, okay, this is a site about Martin Luther King. But as he pointed out, we were all easily drawn into but what people didn't know about Martin Luther King was this, this, and this. And it was basically eventually starting to question a lot of his ideas and ideals and principles and so on, and starting to insert more and more negative content about him. And it was actually a site that had been set up by a neo-Nazi white supremacist group. But it was easy to suck in people. That's like advertising. You get drawn in by something really nice at the top, and then suddenly someone's trying to sell you some bizarre stuff. I don't know.
Yes, of course.
So authenticating critical thinking.
Yes, and in terms of legacy, what interview are you most proud of?
That's an interesting question, because I'm always asked who's your favorite interviewee, and of course that can vary on who's in my mind at the moment. It could be Peter Gabriel, who I was a huge fan of as a musician. It could be Stephen Hawking, because that was a phenomenal interview to be able to do.
What was he like?
Well, this was the interesting thing. I often get asked the question, do you, when doing an interview, give questions out in advance? And I said, well, no, we never did. Traditional media says, look, we're happy to tell you the topics and cover certain areas because, you know, the interviewee should know what it's about. But we wouldn't give out questions. I said, there's only one person I ever gave questions to in advance. And most people don't get it. A few did. And I give the clue, I had to give them 2 weeks in advance because that's how long it took him to type out with his little, lens on his cheek with the twitching his cursor along the computer and to do and we got 10 minutes with him. And I remember at that time, my producer saying, well, 10 minutes, what are we going to do? That's not enough for a show. And I said, would you give up 10 minutes with Stephen Hawking? I wouldn't, So that was fantastic. I was very proud of that, in all honesty, because, again, he was so frozen physically that it would be easy to be distracted and not look him in the eye. But when someone is staring at you that way, it takes quite a lot of, holding it together to be able to look them in the eye, these crystal clear blue eyes, That was a great interview, I must say. I really enjoyed doing that one.
Just lastly, I'll just finish on, what advice would you give to any young journalists now in the world?
Well, first, decide on the platform that you're going to choose. Because if you're going to go for a traditional media channel, that's got its own kind of path. But if you're going to go down the path of social media or down the path of creating your own channel, very possible nowadays, and not a bad way to start, actually. I think it's important to take the trouble to learn as much as possible. Now, the beauty of what we have now is we have the world in our hands, on our mobile phones. There is so much content out there from which people can learn. If you want to learn the piano, you can learn it watching YouTube videos. It's really interesting. So take the trouble to look at media training courses, learn how to do the job properly. And that way it prepares you not only for traditional media, but also for social media, where at least you can say with some authenticity that I've done some preparation as a journalist, not simply gone for the clicks or influencing. It's a tough one, but I would say that's probably the best advice. Learn the craft.
So you've just stated that Stephen Hawking, he was your favorite interview. Who would you like to interview? Who haven't you ticked off the list yet?
There are loads. I mean, I would gladly interview President Trump. People say, why would you?
Because if you're watching Donald.
Well, I was going to say, they would say, those who don't like him say, why would you? Those who like him say, of course you'd want to. As a journalist, my job is not to judge the person so much, but to get to the story and get to the person as much as possible in terms of my questions. Always difficult with someone like him because obviously he's very much in charge with his media management. But Barack Obama, I wish I'd managed to interview him. It would have been very interesting. I did find it very funny that Zach Galifianakis, the comedian, interviewed him on his show, Between Two Ferns, and his opening question was, what's it like to be the last black president of America? It'd be great to do a satirical show, I must admit. But I would say, people like that, they in terms of US presidents, definitely. There's almost no one I wouldn't want to interview in that sense. Anyone who has an influence on the way the world's news cycle is being shaped, Vladimir Putin, Vladimir Zelensky. All these people are valid interviewees for me because they're part of that news story. Then there are the people I actually also enjoy interviewing, which are, the quirky Hollywood actors or Bollywood actors, and I've done all those as well. It's been really interesting because, again, I don't want to just simply do a kind of little puffy piece on their latest movie. I want to find out about the person, and I've had that benefit too with some of the shows I've done.
Yes, and what was the worst interview? Now, obviously, kind of working in the media, we've all had stuff where maybe the cameras didn't work or maybe the guest didn't turn up. Is there anything in particular, a bit of a blooper that stands out in your mind?
I can actually tell you this because it haunts me to this day. During the former Yugoslav war, Vuk Drašković was deputy leader in Serbia, and he actually was one of these interesting characters who flip-flopped a lot when it came to his views, which I thought was also quite unique because you never knew where he was going to stand on an issue. But I had gone to London to do the interview from the office there, and we had a situation where it was bouncing off about 6 satellites. So there was a 7-second delay between me asking the question and him hearing it, and then him answering and me hearing the answers. And that's the satellite delays, mostly minimized now, especially with the internet, but they were the biggest nightmare, biggest nightmare. And so the problem I had with him was that I was asking him what Serbian troops were doing right then in Kosovo. And his answers were basically about how Serbs had been persecuted down the centuries. And I said to him, look, we can talk about history afterwards, but right now, the question everyone is asking is, what are Serbian troops doing in Kosovo? I won't be held back on this, but of course, with the 7-second delay, it was the most cartoon-like interview. And it was 7 minutes long. I remember that, because I got off the set and someone said to me, oh, I'm glad I didn't have to do that. It was literally like that. So it was a combination of difficult interviewee, difficult logistics and technical issues, and just physically exhausting.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt. It's a lot harder than it looks. I can attest to that. You've also interviewed a very controversial figure, Andrew Tate. We went to his house in Romania. It garnered a lot of views over the 2 videos. I think it got close to 3 million views. What was your reaction to him? He seems very much a different person when the cameras switch on.
Yeah, well, that's the case with many people, actually, and especially in the case of someone like Andrew Tate, who's obviously a very smart guy, whether you agree with his views or not. He's a very smart guy because he can handle things on the fly. But what was interesting is my style of interviewing is conversational, not argumentative, and that's what he's more used to. So it was quite fascinating to have him, find himself, I think, on the spot a little bit with questions that just required a simple answer and, not an argument. So one I remember is, where I asked him, do you believe in gender equality? Because he was talking about the roles of men and women and his influence on young men and, the controversies over him with women. So I said, do you believe in gender equality? And he started to sort of answer it, but then was wondering whether he was going to get trapped into something. And he just said, that's a trick question. So that was an interesting, because I wouldn't have expected that a little bit. But he's obviously very different off camera. He's less about the charged energy and wanting to kind of shout and be aggressive with his viewpoints. So always a fascinating interview with someone like that. And, having seen him in Dubai recently, he had a massive group of people who'd come to see him.
He had a meet and greet, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And we went along. The one thing that surprised me is that we'd done a number of Vox Pops that were, obviously, you ask people there, what do they think of him?
Yeah.
And I was surprised there was a number of women who were quite outspoken in their support of him, which was surprising.
So again, but you see, as a journalist, we shouldn't make assumptions in the sense that, all women dislike him because there are cases against him pending, which involve women and accusations of rape and trafficking and things like this. We shouldn't assume that all women hate him in the same way we shouldn't assume all young men like him. He's a divisive character. As a result, there will be people on both sides. But that doesn't, stop it being an interesting interview and interesting to hear people's perspectives. And yes, some women were there saying that they found him inspirational. One of the young women said about how, for her, he was inspirational in his thing about, being a strong character or making money or being fit or so it works for some people, I guess.
I have to tell one anecdote there. So we were prepping in Andrew Tate's house for the interview. We were going over the questions, and he had this enormous dog. I don't know, was it an XL bully? It was like a small horse, honestly. So it approached Riz. I'm setting up the cameras, etc., making sure everything else is all right. And then I get called from Riz. He goes, Michal, can you get this dog away from me, please?
Well, I was trying to make some last-minute notes, and this dog was like looking for attention, very friendly actually, but it was massive, so of course it was pushing me out. So I was trying to get you to look after it, and I could just see you sweating behind the camera there.
Yeah, he said, Michal, can you move this dog for me? I said, Riz, I certainly can't move that dog. I think if you stop stroking it, it will leave you alone. That's what I said.
Should have got your saddle. You could have ridden it.
Yeah, oh my God, absolutely. So I will just end on, what would be your advice to a young journalist who's trying to make sense of the world in a post-truth world?
So there are a couple of things to consider. Things change very quickly. And the platforms change very quickly. If you said to someone, get your stuff onto Facebook, they'd look at you in horror now, the younger people, because it's like, well, we don't even go to Facebook. And everything shifts the whole time. It was Facebook, YouTube had its own kind of weird area, and now it's become huge in terms of people creating channels. So I would say two things. One, look at the direction in which you want to go as a journalist. If it's the mainstream media, there is a particular path. If it's creating your own content, being a content creator as they are now, you have a lot of freedom that way. It's often a good way to start because it can be a good way to practice the skills, because the traditional media usually wants trained people. Since training is hard to come by, formal training, whether you going to university, college, whatever, there is a lot of content out there. On the internet. We have the world at our fingertips in terms of knowledge and information. Learn the craft. There's enough out there to teach you the craft so that at least you as a journalist can be authentic. Learn, what is involved in authenticating material, validating it, checking, whether it's fake or not, checking whether what sources are the right ones to go to for the right content. Because that's another factor. There's so many sources of information now. Being able to filter and sift through them to get the right content, to make your own content authentic, is a challenge in itself. And learn to think critically, because that's the big thing that's missing nowadays. People aren't taught to think critically. It's like grab whatever is sensational, grab whatever gets clicks. I guess the advice is don't worry about the clicks, at least for now. Worry about being authentic and getting the skills, getting the craft right.
Are journalists still important in the modern world?
Yeah, hugely. But how journalism is presented now has become very difficult to gauge for a lot of people, which is why they go for characters. There's an old golden rule, people watch people. So people like Piers Morgan, Tucker Carlson, all these who were with main networks, they've gone independent. They've got their own channels now, and they know they can take an audience with them because people watch people. That was something, it took a lot of channels time to learn, because they always said, well, the star is the news, which it is true, it's true. But what they've realized now is that people watch people. So journalists are very important, but I think what's important is those journalists have to be properly trained and be authentic in their work.
We're just out of time, Riz. I could speak to you all night. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
My pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all we have time for on Global News today. Thanks for watching, and be sure to join us for more exclusive insights tomorrow.